We're going to record. Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody, both in the building and on YouTube. My name is Marty Rowland. I'm the education chair for the Henry George School of Social Science, and we welcome people contacting the school with any questions during the YouTube live streaming, or you can call the school after the class starts. This is a 6-class course, and we're going to cover the first half of the book, Progress and Poverty. I've got a little bit fuller explanation of what the title is, which is interesting. But so what I'm going to be presenting is, before I get into the slides, who I am and some of my backgrounds. But I do want to point out that we're going to hold questions within the building until maybe an hour or so. What I have are 48 slides that were posted on the website, so everybody had an opportunity to look at that. I'm hoping that I don't go beyond 90 minutes. But the thing to keep in mind is that whenever I got a quote or a sentence and I've got a page number in parentheses, that means it's directly from Henry George's book. I've got a diagram that has some direct information from his social problems, but that's an exception. Mostly what you're going to see on the slides today are from Progress and Poverty in the chapters that we're going to cover today. Otherwise, if there's nothing attributed to Henry George, the quotations are mine or attributed to me, and I'll make it very clear. So, once again, my name is Marty Rowland. My PhD is in urban studies, natural resource economics. I studied under Daniel W. Bromley. I'm a registered professional engineer in the states of New York and Louisiana. I retired from Lockheed Martin, and I currently work for the city. I'm an environmental professional. I'm also a passive house designer, if people are familiar with the German certification, energy efficiency. A point of interest that I need to research a little bit, but my grandfather was a union president in Michigan at a paper plant in the 1930s. And once I find out more about that, I guess I can talk more about it. But so let me go. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to announce the slide that you're on if you've got the slides off of the website. They're not going to correspond to these slides up on the wall tonight because well, I'll just let that be said. So let me describe the full title of.
I'm a little confused because what I see here, it says it's live.
Oh, there's a.
It says it's live, but if you go to the website, it's
Okay.
live.
Well, the slide up there is going to be different than what they're looking at if they've got the slide from the website, because what I did was, you know, when you have a list of 5 things and you want to say 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, you know, you add duplicate sides. So it doesn't matter what it's saying up there. I'm saying what the slide is for the benefit of people looking at the archive or people that are looking at live. So class number 1, Introduction to Henry George and His Work. This is September 19th, 2019. We're in Manhattan at 149 East 38th Street. Hopefully we won't have any fire engines going by and making a lot of noise. So it's interesting that this course or this class, we're going to start with a little bit from Book 7, Chapter 5. And this was a suggestion that was made to me by Cliff Cobb, former president of the Robert F. Schachenbach organization. The idea was that you go further into the book so that you kind of know where you're going to, so you don't get bogged down in the beginning books of the Progress and Poverty. And I do that, and I think it comes out pretty well. So I think it's good to keep in mind what Henry George described in the subtitle, Progress and Poverty, an Inquiry into the Cause of Industrial Depressions and of Increase of Want with Increase of Wealth, the Remedy. So you should expect, after taking this 6-class course and then in the spring of 2019, understanding what he's getting at in terms of the remedy for industrial depressions, because several experts are now saying that we should be expecting something as a downturn, which we'll get to in a little bit, and then we can take questions at the end. So another thing that's important is that this book was written and made available in 1879 when Henry George left California and came to New York. So it's interesting that he came at the end of the Depression in the U.S. It started in 1874. It was a crisis in 73. That was the first international financial crisis. A lot of different reasons, we can talk about that. But the timing was perfect. Now, whether Henry George knew that he was going to be on that wave of interest, he was. So it's very interesting to understand what made his book, Progress and Poverty, such a hit, was that it was a worldwide concern that was going on. So that was slide 4, if you're following from the slides on the website. So the next one is a quote from page 49. I am not writing a textbook, but only attempting to discover the laws which control a great social problem. So keep in mind that he's trying to explain factors and terms that are confused at the time in 1879, where writers were using the word capital and interest and wages and relationships, and they're all over the place. In fact, I'm going to show where speakers outside of Henry George were all over the place. And his main point is to be very clear so he can develop the science of political economy, is what he ends up doing. So I'm going to go through a few things before we get into the meat of this, because I think it's very important, because there's a lot of confusion today and even in the past of where Henry George was at. For example, there's still questions about whether he was a socialist or a progressive and all this, but it's very clear that Henry George speaks from a community perspective. You can find that on page 40 and 44. We're on slide 6 in the presentation. This is regarding capital and wealth. Increases in land values are not increases in community wealth. Of course, if you collect the land value and put it to community wealth, it will be, but without any intervention, increases in land value are not community wealth. So it's very important to understand that community perspective, because he's very much concerned about not so much individual wealth, but community. And I think this is a very important point too, is that his perspective is to stop inequality. So if you're stopping inequality, it doesn't make wealth equally distributed, it just makes it a better chance that it could be. So you can understand that point in terms of whether he was a socialist or not. I think in terms of a socialist, they would try to intervene in the economy to make wealth equally distributed. He was saying, let's just stop the inequality and go from there. That was slide number 7 in the package. Also, he used the word aggregate wealth. So he was concerned about aggregate wealth, not individual wealth, page 41. And this is slide number, still slide number 6, I suppose. Then the last one was, there may be relative wealth in a community, yet with a few drops of ink, it could be utterly annihilated. And this relates to why bonds, for example, are not wealth. He makes a point of this on page 40, where if one person benefits in a community at the expense of another one, you put them together and they cancel out. So if somebody's having a hard time paying a debt, for example, if you have a few drops of ink and it's blessed by the authorities, you could utterly annihilate that kind of relative wealth. So that's really where he's coming from. This is slide 7. This is something I put on a T-shirt, and I was standing up making a presentation about Eleanor Ostrom in Baltimore at the Council of Georgia's Organizations, and it got a pretty good review. Henry George makes socialism superfluous, meaning that if you implement the ideas of Henry George, there would be no need for socialism because you're achieving the most of the, if not all the gain or the ideas of a socialist perspective. So that was slide 7. And this is a little inside George's joke. I hope people can appreciate this. Henry George was not talking about avoiding reading your assignments when he said, desires being satisfied with the least exertion. So I don't know if that's a yuck, but you know, it's a Henry George joke. And that was, so you have the syllabus. There's reading assignments for next time. It's essentially the second half of book 1. Today we're going to focus on book 1, which is chapters 1 and 2. Next week, book 1, chapters 3, 4, 5. So, and that was slide 8. So let's go over this is what I'm going to talk about today. So if you can keep in mind these 4 points here, I'm going to go into book 7, chapter 5, and it talks about property in the U.S., primarily out west, California, the gold rush and such. Then I'm going to talk about the introduction and teaching tools. So even though there's materials in the book from Henry George, I'm going to introduce you to ideas that I find useful in order to explain the material. Some ideas that I came up with. But also, I put together some slides directly out, well, the information came directly out of Progress and Poverty about the distribution of wealth, how it works with land, labor, and capital, and production, and where rent goes and where rent probably should go, and returns to capital and wages. Then I'm going to get into book 1, chapters 1 and 2. Then I'm going to do a short little segue to book 1, chapter 3, 4, 5 for class 2. So the way this is going to work, if you see in the syllabus, class 1 and 2 are back to back 1 week, and then the next week on the 26th. Then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to do another one, take a break. So what I'm doing when I take a break between classes is give you time to read, because it's very important to read the book. You can get the whole book online for free. You can purchase a book from Ibrahima for $10. So let's see, I'm on page 9 from the presentation. So why start with book 7, chapter 5? Well, George's Progress of Poverty is an immense work to comprehend, and it often helps to see where you're headed before the journey begins. This was Cliff Cobb's recommendation. I think it was very well stated. So I wanted to point this out because this is a very poignant point that is made, you know, more than halfway through. That slavery was not abolished when the 14th Amendment was ratified. No equality to the right of all to land. This is on page 394 and slide 10. So if there's no equality to the right of all to land, then free institutions are in vain. This is exactly what he said. Common schools are in vain. Discoveries and inventions that add force that presses the masses down. So if by not having an equal right to land, this is what happens. First principles is what Henry George gets into. Now, I'm going to leave Book 7, Chapter 5 to slide 30. So in 20 slides, I'm going to pick this back up. I need to get into the introduction and the tools that I'm going to be using. So this is slide 11, if you're following from the website. So I'm going to be, before we go any further, I wanted to introduce how the course is going to be taught, and then the use of 3 teaching tools. And if you attended the Baltimore conference, or maybe the June 5th seminar that we had, some of the slides might be familiar, but I didn't reuse too many of them. So tonight there's a live YouTube video for live streaming and archiving. So I'm hoping that people in the future, my great grandkids maybe could look at it and say, they sure were confused, weren't they? Or maybe they were enlightened. So the other thing is that you must visit the Henry George School of Social Science website to access the slides for the lecture. So when I say that we're on slide 11, you need to get the slides there. Okay, beginning next week, which is class 2, you need to read Progress and Poverty before class. Otherwise, questions may not be answered. Rather, I may advise you to rewatch the prior lectures. So it's very important to stay on top if you really want to get an idea of what's going on in the class. I think it's going to be very valuable going book by book and chapter by chapter of Progress and Poverty, because every time you read it, you get new insights. At least I did. So let me go to slide, okay, teaching tools. There are 3 teaching tools I want to talk about. Now, Henry George didn't use the word intellectual gutter talk. This is something that I created, but he called things vulgar errors. I'm not sure that he called things vulgar lies, but he did say vulgar errors. And I think it's good to put it in 21st century talk, because there's things that are said in society by experts, and in Henry George's time by experts like, well, not necessarily Adam Smith because he was gone, but John Stuart Mill and others who expressed views that were counter to what Henry George was getting at. And this is the interesting thing about reading Progress and Poverty, is that he doesn't put any particular thinker, philosopher, economist on a pedestal. He's very critical of these people, even though he finds a lot of value. In a minute, I'll show you his divergence with Adam Smith. But the first one is this intellectual gutter talk, how you're supposed to be fooled. And the 2 things that you'll get when you read the book is the idea where wages come from. Is that by not having a clear idea of where wages come from, you're subject to being fooled in a way that will lead you astray from what he's trying to get at. Another thing you'll get in class number 3 on the Malthus analysis, the idea of population and the limitation of population by sustenance. That's another intellectual gutter idea that needs to be dispensed with. He spends a whole book on that, at least 1 chapter. So whenever these intellectual gutter talks come up, you might find something in today's talk. You say, doesn't that fit that category? And I show a few of them here. Now, I introduced in June 5th, and then in the Baltimore talk, this idea of a hope crisis continuum. And I'm going to go into it a little bit, because I think it's a good mechanism to analyze what we're trying to do in the Henry George School and philosophy in general and political science, where a person stands and where people who are opposed to use stand. I think it's important to understand that dynamic. And also the idea of dimensionality, because you might say, for example, if you're talking very linearly, that if you take one step forward and 2 steps back, you're never going to advance. But in the diagram that I'll be showing, you can take 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and still progress. It doesn't seem to make any sense, but once you understand things outside of a first dimension, it'll make sense. And then the last one is how to distribute produced wealth, wages from exerted labor, interest to the capitalist, and rent for the social adjustments, a word that Henry George uses throughout the Social Problems book. He also uses it in Progress and Poverty. So these are the 3 teaching tools, and I'm going to go through each of them right now, and then we'll get into the material in the Progress and Poverty. So understanding intellectual gutter talk. You're going to read in book 1 of Progress and Poverty about population increases until sustenance can't keep up. And so it's almost a way of blaming victims. For example, in colonial Africa, people will say, oh, it's just the problem with that population, that it's overpopulated because they can't get the sustenance. There's many reasons why a population might be apparently overpopulated, but it's not related to the Malthusian theory that we're going to go into a lot of detail. But the primary thing that he gets into in book 1 is where wages come from. And he lays out page after page of what the problem is by thinking that wages come from capital. It's also putting workers at this low level, like, please, Mr. Billionaire, give us some money so that we can have some wages. And before the end of the class today, I think it's going to be clear why he makes a big point of that wages come from labor and the exertion of labor and not from capital. Just as an aside, trade policy wasn't George's primary concern. I'm not going to get into that but we can talk about it at some time. There's a more common or a more recent idea, tragedy of the commons, fits into this intellectual gutter talk, because in the theory of tragedy of the commons, the solution, of course, is to privatize everything or to give it to the state to run. And I don't want to get into any details about this, but it fits in that category of gutter talk. Also, supply and demand really doesn't go beyond the commercial shop level. Necessary social adjustments will not be supplied until the community sees that they are. That it takes individual action to see that adjustments and poverty is done away with, injustice. So it's not a graph that, well, we got a supply of something, what's the demand, let's map it out. That's kind of like a linear type looking at the economy. So this is, if people are following online, this is slide 14. I guess before I go off that, the idea of population increases until sustenance can keep up, that was an early, Malthus expressed an early version of the idea of carrying capacity, which is like it's imposed. But in the human mind, we can create additional factors and wealth that will extend what the carrying capacity is. If you look at the 8 million people in New York City and put them in Arizona, I suppose, yeah, they've overdone their carrying capacity, but an apples and oranges thing. So Hope Crisis Continuum. I presented this before, but I wanted to go through this just so that you understand it if I mention it in a lecture, or if Alan Smith or Steve Taft later on uses this. It's seeing through the lens of domination or justice seeking. So if you're familiar with Henry George at all, you'll know that he promoted the single tax, the idea that you only tax land value and you let income tax and gas tax and tax on your buildings and such to go away. You don't pay at the MTA to get on the subway. There's a single tax because that's sufficient to run society. So this is a view of one step forward, two steps back, because if you see a movement toward the right, you're increasing crisis and you're increasing hope. So your crisis kind of doubles when you take one step, but your crisis doubles. So one step forward with getting more hope and two steps back, but you're still approaching the maximum there. I used this slide in Baltimore because I was talking about Elinor Ostrom and the common pool. And in that talk, I talked about how you could use the concept of the common pool factors identified with the land value that's part of a single tax. So if you imagine yourself on the left side of the crisis, okay, one step forward, two steps back, but you're going toward the mountaintop, as Martin Luther King might have said. You know, that there's a lot of struggle to get there, but once you're over it, you're on one step forward, three steps forward, because the crisis is going away. And this is the kind of hopeful idea of why you stick on and carry on, because you know that once you've achieved this threshold, you're moving forward. So that's really what the hope crisis continuum is all about. It's understanding where you sit within a situation with respect to your adversaries, because your adversaries always want you to be on the left side of the hope crisis continuum, and you have to say, well, I know better than that. The other one is how to distribute produced wealth. Wages from labor. This is part of the, let's see. We're on slide 19, if you're following these slides on the website. Wages from labor, this is a truism from Henry George. Interest goes to the capitalist and rent for social adjustments. I'm showing this because without any intervention, the rent is going to go to the landowner, and if the landowner keeps on jacking up what he needs, there's going to be less money for less wealth for the capitalist and less wealth for labor, which I'm going to show in a second. So this is one of a few slides that have a nice photo, and you can see very limited amount of capital in this agricultural operation. So if the farmer also owns the land, you got labor and land working together to produce things, and if it's the same person, they get it all. But if it's a landowner that's allowing the farmer to work there, then the labor gets a produce that they agreed on before the whole thing began. So the next slide, a little bit better than my slide there, is a little bit more involved. And nothing that you see on this slide is something that I made up. This is all comes from Progress and Poverty. And it's kind of curious that I haven't seen anybody diagram this out. Henry George didn't diagram it out. I'd imagine he could have, but there might have been a strategy behind that. But the whole idea is that you got three factors in production, which is the way that Henry George describes it. Land and labor coming together with capital to create a production, and you have this produce. And what's left after that is wages, interest, and rent. I guess it's kind of like a natural law, if somebody doesn't change it, is that the rent is going to the landowner. And then the interest, which is just the returns to the capitalist, this is not bank interest. He makes a very important point in the book that he's not talking about bank interest. This is essentially the money that's made from this production operation. And then he describes what's called a true wages fund. So when you have production going on, there should be a wages fund by the capitalist, because he got to pay his labor the rate that they were promised. So this answers the question of where wages come from. They don't come from capital. And I got a joke in a second about that idea. And see, that was slide 21, if you're following that. So, so I think that's the distribution of wealth, and that, I guess, the simplest idea. Now, it's also important to see the replaced consumed capital, because so in the farming situation, the wheel is going to fall off, or the various components of what you're seeing there needs to be replaced. So this is the diagram that's laid out in Progress and Poverty. And I'm presenting this now. It comes more into later books and chapters, but I wanted to describe it now. It was that production, Henry George is saying that production means adapting, which includes manufacturing gas and water and heat, electricity, public library, public school, public health, recreation, roads, bridges, telegraph, highway, post office, telegraph, railroads, deepening the riverbed, lighthouse, public market, issuing money, and reduce the appropriative power of aggregate capital. So that's so I put on this slide option 2. So if you let the landlord just go off with the community wealth, that's one thing. But Henry George is saying, read my book, think for yourself. Don't you think it'd make more sense, since it's our wealth that's being generated, to invest in these public improvements? Because then when a business comes in, an entrepreneur might come in, they've got all these things, and they're kind of like, they're setting themselves up to be the best place to be, and then you hire people and pay people, and you can get a circulation of wealth. That's what he's getting at. And borrowing from another presentation, the idea that wages, interest, and the rent should go to the community in the way of services, what I call the common pool collective, which kind of coincides with Eleanor Ostrom, but we're not going to focus on that as much here. So that was slide 24. Duty of government. What Henry George is saying throughout this book is the idea that if you relieve the injustices or the inefficiencies, then the economy will essentially take care of itself. That if you do away with the inequities and that we get into. So what is political economy? This is on the slide 28 in the presentation. So Henry George says on page 11 that it's not a set of dogmas, and so political, maybe we owe him the opportunity to use the land and the labor to create wealth, but nothing more. But as landowner, nothing per se, nothing. Now, I'm from Michigan, and sometimes I use colloquialisms. I put down here, shit or get off the pot. That's the idea of that. If you're a landowner and you're just holding this vacant land and preventing income from being generated, the idea is get off the pot. We're going to acquire your lot because you're not being fair to the rest of us. So as a nation grew to the West Coast, and this is where he gets in page 388. Trying to make sure okay, this is slide 34 if you're following. So then it filled in. So you go to the West Coast from the east, fills in between, available public land decreased dramatically. And he says on these pages that this is the same process that ruined the republics of antiquity. I'd like for somebody to find out what he's talking about. Is he talking about Rome? Is he talking about Greece? He's talking about some republics in antiquity, and that'd be a good point to talk about. Denying equal and inalienable right to soil denies equal right of life and liberty. So he asks this question: is this prudence, foresight, industry, and thrift, or is it the gains from monopoly at the expense of labor. I think we'll all agree that it's the monopoly. But you can hear this argument of somebody who's a landowner making money hand over fist, saying, well, it's just prudence, foresight, industry, thrift. You know, I deserve this stuff that you created for me. And then the slide 35, America's national character is based on the fact of cheap land. So you can understand why people get these ideas and maybe counter to what Henry George is getting at, because we've always had this cheap land and we had these ideas that we should always have this arrangement. So despite technological advances, masses of people cannot make a living. Property and land is concentrating. And then he gets into this connection between New England at the time, in the 1870s, 80s, comparing that with Ireland. And people are familiar with the Ireland question. In fact, one of Henry George's prominent followers was Father McGlynn, who was a Catholic priest that we'll get into at some point. But one of the reasons he was attracted to Henry George was what Henry George talked about the plight of the Irish, where you had English landowners living in Paris and London owning the land in Ireland, and the workers in Ireland couldn't even eat what they were growing because it was marketed to pay the rent for the landowners. But the same thing was being practiced in New England, where the proprietary people owning this, where a quarter to a half of the crop is due to landowners. So it's like modern slavery is what he was getting at. So this is the last slide, slide 36, on the book 7, chapter 5. So this is all the result of natural law. Harder times, lower wages, higher rates of poverty, just like gravitation. So even though it's a result of natural law, humans can intervene on laws of nature. You know, we know that humans put paddle wheels at the top of falling water and generate electricity. You know, God didn't come down and say you can't do that. You just take advantage of the opportunities. So humans can intervene by creating institutions and social adjustments that bend society toward justice. And I think this is kind of like the segue to what Henry George is getting at. So you understand part of chapter 5 of book 7, but Henry George is always pointing out that there is an opportunity to move toward justice within a capitalist system. So slide 37, I start with book 1, chapter 1, and he's talking about wages. And we are coming close to the first hour. I think people in here, you know, feel free to get up and use the restroom or such, but we're going to keep on going, then we'll open it up for questions. So we're on book 1, chapter 1. Let's see exactly what Henry George says about wages, because I explained he was trying to get people away from this idea that wages comes from capital. So the entire chapter is about prominent intellectual gutter talk about the origin of wages. I mean, that's the only thing that you can come up with if you read this very carefully. He says that there is no predetermined wage fund, although this is the idea that was accepted as truth by influential people, and he talks about this on page 17. Are we still on YouTube? Okay.
YouTube failed.
Oh, it failed?
Miserably, yeah.
Okay, so I guess we'll have to post this?
That's what we are trying to do now.
Okay. So the theory goes something like this. This is what's being promoted by the influential people. Wages can only be paid with capital that the capitalist stores up, determined by dividing capital in hand by the number of laborers working. So here's my joke, is that if you ran a lemonade stand, would you sell your lemons to pay the wages for your sister. Of course you wouldn't sell your lemons because you need to have the lemons to make the lemonade to get the interest on your capital so that you can pay your sister from that pot. And this is really all that Henry George is saying, is that, but this is one of the, what I call the intellectual gutter talk, because people are used to this idea that, the capitalist comes in, or maybe the government comes in, provides the money, and then creates the jobs. Well, the jobs and the wages are being paid by what they do to advance the produce of what they're doing. And you have to keep that in mind, because it's a labor-centric idea of how the economy works. And if you're a laborer, why wouldn't you have a labor-centric view of how the economy works? So don't sell yourself short, I think is what Henry George is saying. So if you can keep that lemonade stand clear, I think you'll be avoiding some of the ideas. So in class 3, we're going to cover the Malthusian theory that he calls a sister vulgar lie to the wages fund, that he says is rapidly permeating the general mind on page 18. And that was slide 39. So this Malthusian and the wages fund idea, it allowed protectionists in the trade policy to deceive workers, that is, foreign workers who are taking from this predetermined wages fund. So it's kind of like you need to support protective labor policies because of this lie. So it's kind of like you need to understand that lies are told for some purpose that you may not be aware of what the liar is trying to get at. So labor goes toward high wages. This is kind of like a common sense thing. But if you believe in that wages fund idea that it comes from capital, you might be fooled into not accepting this. That capital also goes toward higher rates of interest, which is more money on your capital. So if you can imagine that, you got wages, and then you've got this pot of money, and then the number of workers down here, and you're always dependent on the number of workers or the amount of capital. If the workers went down to like a few, you'd have a lot of surplus money sitting up there. So it's kind of like a false equation that Henry George is looking at. One of the things I wanted to get at, and maybe this is going into like 20th century from 19th century, but if you can imagine describing rocket thrust to a 19th century person like Henry George, they might understand the idea of liquid fuel and gravity, just sitting there and you got gravity. But once the rocket starts accelerating, you're going to have to throttle back the fuel because the rocket is accelerating, which is forcing more fuel down into the engine. So once things start working in a dynamic phase, it's a lot different than statics. And I think what Henry George gets at is that the people that he opposes are so stuck on linear and static relationships that they don't see the dynamics of what he's trying to describe. So he also talked about the division of labor, also weighs in his thinking about the person who digs worms for the fisherman works to catch fish as much as a person holding pole over the water, which also relates to the idea, is there a capital fund that's paying the person who's digging the worms, who's fishing? Well, no. You're digging the worms, helping the fishermen, working together, and that's how the economy works. So he's bringing up all these examples of refuting the labor or wages coming from capital. It's also important that returns received for exertions are beyond manual labor, and this is one of the things that gets confused. But he also includes professional men, managers, clerks, anybody who's using their mind, and even shopkeepers, even though they're running a business, a lot of what they do are earning wages as laborers. So that was really book 1, chapter 1, into the wage, where wages come from. Now he switches into what capital is, and this is kind of an interesting treatment because there's a lot of disagreement, and I'll show about what Henry George talked about capital. and understand that he's not just being new, that, well, this is my idea about capital, and you can have your own ideas, and I'm gonna, I'm gonna shout it from the rooftop. What he's trying to do is he's laying out a science of political economy and having very precise meanings for words so that you never have to backtrack, that it's never going to be separate. And he's correcting major intellects while he's doing this, but he's doing very plotting, step by step. So Henry George says, without a clear definition of the terms, he cannot hope to make himself properly understood, on page 31. And that was slide 42 that we're on. Land, labor, and capital. He says these are factors in production, and I'm not sure whether in is significant, but he does use the word factors in production. So there's a variety of definitions that he points out, and these are instrumental to show how he differs from others. Some people include human capital. In fact, this was one of the questions that was posed to me in Baltimore at the Council of Georgist Organizations. What do I think about the idea of human capital? And I said, well, there's no such thing as human capital in the Georgist way of understanding it, because that's labor. You know, it's a person thinking, they do have capabilities, but to define things like human capital, you're essentially walking over Henry George's grave and making things cluttered so that you won't understand political economy. There's nothing to be gained by it other than maybe having a catchy title to sell a book, but that's a travesty if you're a Georgist. Others said food, clothing, shelter. After all, people don't show up naked at work. They have to have food, clothing, shelter, but that's not capital in the way Henry George looked at. He also says that people say that land is capital, and we know that in the neoclassical development after Henry George dies, this is kind of like the death knell of the Georgist movement when the Georgists didn't, I guess, emolliate themselves and say, no, land isn't capital, and I'm gonna be very strict about this. Others, that capital must be accumulated first. This is the idea of the wages fund. And I guess, by and large, Henry George prefers what Adam Smith had to say, that which affords a man with revenue or wealth devoted to procuring more wealth. There's other things that he says that I'm going to go into here, but I do want to point out that Adam Smith did say that he said that, he believed that there's things such as human capital. So not only Adam Smith, but Henry Carey, who's a famous protectionist. Kind of interesting that a protectionist and a free trader would put human capital in as something that's capital. But it's kind of interesting to read this about how Henry George varies with experts. Also, that part of wealth devoted to the aid of production. You can find that on page 42. And we're on slide 43, but it just happened. The problems others have with their definition of capital is that they begin with assumptions. This is Henry George, page 46. Then they deduce from a preconceived idea how capital assists production. George says, no, you have to first ascertain what a thing is before settling on what it does. So if you read this book and you see how other people are defining capital, you'll see that what's not being done is ascertaining what the thing is, and that's what he's doing in this chapter. So this is money, and this is slide 44. And Henry George points out that money for business and speculation is capital on page 46. Money for personal needs is not capital. It's the idea of what you're devoting the money to. And it's important to understand that money is a claim to wealth. If it's paper bills, it's just something that can burn. So it's a claim to wealth. And this last bullet is something that I discovered while I'm working on the infrastructure material that outside of the Henry George School. The idea of the business golden rule is that money is never to be borrowed unless it's for capital purposes, for making more wealth, create more wealth. That's what capital is. So you never you borrow money for operation maintenance. For example, you don't, like the sanitation department wouldn't borrow money so that they can ship the garbage to Virginia and Ohio and these other states where all of our garbage goes to that we have sitting around the building here. If it's not borrowed, then worn out capital assets should be replaced using a portion of the returns to capital. This idea of the lemonade stand again, is that you don't sell lemons to pay your sister or whatever else you're doing with your table and your chairs and cups. Wealth. He, on this slide 45, not the power of obtaining wealth such as bonds, mortgages, promissory notes, bank bills, or other stipulations for the transfer of wealth. Page 40 is where he gets in this. So now I'm going off on my little rant here. It's interesting that mortgages are not wealth. That's what Henry George says. This is 10 years after the subprime mortgage financial crisis. The question I pose is, should the toxic or the illiquid assets in those banks and insurance companies that have been wiped out with a few drops of ink? So Henry George talks about things that could be wiped out. Very well, those toxic or illiquid assets that was in the TARP program could have been wiped out. So there's talk now about the crisis that we're in right now. Was the crisis that was postponed coming to make a bigger crisis? So this is just hypothetical. He talks about what rent is, returns received by the landholder for the use of land on page 33. And we're getting near to the end here. That was slide 46. Slide 47 is what interest is. It's return received by the capitalist for the use of capital. Page 33. Now, as a segue to class number 2, we go more into the wages produced by labor. Labor always precedes wages on page 57. Maintenance of labor on chapter 4. Government bonds, not wealth, but the power of commanding wealth. So read up on that for the next class, and we'll get into a little bit of a discussion. Then chapter 5, the real functions of capital. So you see what he's doing is defining terms, defining what it is, what it isn't, and then he revisits, talking about the real functions of capital. It is not from any scarcity of capital that the poverty of the masses in civilized countries proceeds. Wages are relatively the lowest where capital is the most abundant. So what he's not talking about there is the share that's going to the landowner in terms of rent. That's typically where the difference is. That was the last slide. We went all the way through 48 slides. The end is 49. We've made it close to about an hour of the course, so I feel good that I've made it through. I think what we'll do is open up questions for the next hour. I think